Hello everyone, this is Ben Ryder from the Academy of Gaming, Film and Animation, and the final thing that we're looking at in this series so far is going to be looking at multiple bones with a single mesh, but looking at it weight painted. Now, to clarify, there are a few extra meshes on here that I've just put in there for aesthetic reasons, but this is the main thing that we're looking at here. So it's deforming in a way that the other ones haven't. Let's say we have a cable or an arm or a leg that is all one piece. How do we paint it, rig it in a way that it gets all of those deforms? So for example, when we move this, we can see that it is actually deforming the whole mesh and moving the vertices and the components rather than the whole object. Up until now, what we've been looking at is the whole mesh. You know, even though we've got all these extra loop cuts in here, they all move according to this one bone, 100% parent sort of thing. It doesn't actually sort of have any sort of small deformations or sort of small, more subtle changes. But this, because it's a cable, or if you're looking at a more organic sort of shot, then it is really important to be able to move it with a little bit of flexibility there. So how does it do this? How do you rig it up so that you can get this effect as well? And where might you use it? And what are some of the things that you'll need to consider? First thing that you are going to want to consider when you're doing this is the actual topology of the object itself. So you'll notice that here, for example, there are no loop cuts around this edge here, whereas there are a lot of loop cuts around here, and they all flow perfectly. So even though it's bent here, it still has that edge flow that if I select one of these and double click, it goes around the whole object. So that's very important. So when we're first rigging up an object, we first want to make sure that when we are modeling it, we're keeping in mind that that is going to be something that we will need. So, for example, if I bring this over here and I wanted to create this, let's just pull this down a bit. The more of these you have, the more flexibility and smoothness you will get. However, the more bones you will need and the more time you will need to spend weight painting, which we'll see in just a second. So I'm just going to expand this up a little bit, move this in and across and up, just so it's looking similar to what we have over here. And then I'm going to start rigging it up. But before I do that, I need to make sure that I freeze transformations to clear up this, and I delete history. Now I can't change any of these things anymore. However, that's now ready for me to rig and animate. So I am going to now get a rig in there by going over here to rigging. And I don't do anything different to the bone structure itself, but I want to consider where I want my joints to be. So I'm going to do this for every second one. If I wanted more detail, I could do it for every single one of them, but I'm not going to. And then we're going to look at how we can do this. I also want to make sure that this is centered in, because its proximity to these different vertices, faces, and edges will affect how it works. Now I need to make sure that I've moved that I go back, and I make sure I freeze transformations. So how do I actually get this to there? Well, if I'm in modeling, I want to go over here to rigging. So it's not something that's here. I mean, you can actually access it by going to bind skin here, or you can go over here to rigging and go to skin here. So I want to select the mesh first, and I want to select the root bone. That is the first bone that I use there. So you want to consider as well how you rig this and what is going to be the most dominant sort of bone that will affect everything else. But once I've done that, I simply go to skin and I go bind skin. It will take a moment to think about that depending on the topology, how many edges you have, how many bones you have, and the complexity of the shape. But once it is done, you will notice that these now have a different color because every bone has a different influence on different parts of this. So as I sort of move this, you will notice now that there is a softer sort of definition. It's almost like soft select and how you would sort of keyframe those parts in there. So how can I actually, what's actually going on here? How can I visualize this to show what's actually happening? And how could we potentially adjust this if it's doing something that we don't want it to do? So for example here, if this was coming off and I was seeing this gap here and I didn't want this to have that much effect, how might I fix that? Well, I select the mesh first and I go over here to skin and I go here to paint, skin, weights. So when we're talking about weights, we're talking about influence. So a lot of weight means more influence, less weight means less influence. So the white on here means it has 100% sort of influence. Sorry, I've just gotten out of that. I'll go back in. And that compares to each bone here. So you can see here at the top, if I wanted more influence, I could left click and drag down here, and now they're more influenced by this bone up here, which obviously we don't want. But if I wanted to fix, say, for example, down here, that I could paint this out and rotate it in such a way that it stays put in that one space and isn't affected by that bone, but is still affected by everything else. So when I'm moving these, it still moves and is affected. It's just not as affected by that root bone there. So there's a lot of different features you can go in here to look at this. One thing you need to consider if you are thinking of using this in your object for your game asset and you've created an animation, is that you have to pick between which one you're going to do. Is the entire object, for example, going to be like this? Or is some of it going to be just weight painted like this for whole objects? And you need to pick early on and stick to it, because if I was to export this out with an animation, this would come through, but these objects here that are just simply parented to this plane here would probably not animate, and I've seen that happen in the past. So you really want to make sure that you're going between one and the other. To make sure that you get like all of this, if I was to skin it, it's just really a matter of, in that weight paint, making sure that that particular mesh is just 100% white all the way around. And there are tools that you can use in there to just blanket fill the entire object, and that's what you would do there. But I just wanted to go through, first of all, what this method is, how you could use it, and just consider how that might be used in your environmental game asset if it's required. But yeah, you can always read more into this from the documentation and have a look at more of the options, but I just wanted to demonstrate that as a particular option.